way that works for all. One that provides the opportunity to deliver aid directly to civilians without diversion by Hamas and other terrorist and criminal groups. The United States will support a future for the people of Gaza that is free of Hamas and full of opportunity. As President Trump emphasized during his recent visit, before our eyes, a new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts and tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together. The United States will do its part to help forge this new reality alongside Israel and our Arab partners. But at the same time, the United States stands with Israel in unequivocally rejecting any effort to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state or impose conditions on Israel which would be unconscionable, an unconscionable reward for the heinous Hamas attack on Israel that massacred and brutally kidnapped Israelis and Americans. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Sigrid Skag and Dr. Feroz Sidwan for their statements. I want to seize this opportunity to express our support to Mr. Tom Fletcher for his briefing of last week on the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, on the morning of Friday, May 23rd, Dr. Ala al-Najjar left her home for her shift at the Nasser Hospital. She didn't know it will be the last time she said goodbye to 9 of her 10 children. This pediatrician, who had spent her life saving children's lives, became a grieving mother, forced to identify the calcinated remains, the calcinated bodies of her own sons and daughters. The body delivered to the emergency room by her colleagues in the very corridors where she once gave hope to others. Dr. Najjar's children had names: Yahya, Raqan, Raslan, Jubran, Eve, Rifan, Sidin, Luqman, and Sidra. All were killed. The eldest was 12-year-old. The youngest, just 6 months. These are these children. They were not members of a Center for Command and Control of Hamas. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, this is Dr. Najjar. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, her husband, Hamdi, is still lying in deep coma. And her 10-year son, Adam, critically wounded, is lying in the hospital. We hope he will be surviving. If Hamdi finally awakes, what will she tell him? And when Adam asks about his brothers and sisters, what story can she tell him? President, in another horrifying scene, young Warda Sheikh Khalil, a 6-year-old girl, tried to flee the flames. Tried to flee the flames. The flames engulfing her school, her shelter, after an Israeli airstrike. This shelter, meant to protect displaced civilians, became a crematory oven. Her mother and siblings were killed. Her father now clings to life. No one in Gaza is spared. Not doctors, not women, not children, and not the displaced. Not even hope itself. Mr. President, figures lost meaning. What is worth of saying 18,000 children dead? These are not only numbers. These are lives. These are dreams. These are voices, playtimes, lullabies. They were extinguished. They were the warmth of homes, the joy of classrooms. They were the pulse of neighborhood. The Israeli army killed them. They killed them deliberately in a mother's arms, in classrooms, in hospitals, in bread lines under staircases, and in tents. Their deaths were not collateral. They were the consequences of a system that sees Palestinian lives as not human, as disposable. There is no fading echo. It is a scream, and these horrors must end. The remaining survivors must be allowed to live. The world must see these children, the Palestinian children, the children of Gaza, as its own children. For Warda, for Ala, for the thousands, for the 18,000 who never got a chance to say goodbye, we must act. Mr. President, words of condemnation are no longer enough. We must act now. Since October the 7th, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more than 54,000 people. Yes, it's no more 53,000 people. Today, it's 54,000 people. Israel wounded more than 123,000 people. And since March 18 alone, more than 3,900 have been killed and over 11,000 wounded. How many more must die before action is taken by the Security Council? How many orphans must roam the ruins of Gaza? How much more blood must be spilled before this council acknowledges that enough is enough? My country, Algeria, bears its responsibility and is determined to push the council to act. The time for indecision is over. Mr. President, the Palestinian people were promised a sovereign state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital by the General Assembly, by this very Security Council, and by the international community. Yet, 3 decades after Oslo, the dream of a Palestinian state is vanishing under the boots of the Israeli occupation and the silence of the international community. The Israeli occupation persists, emboldened by impunity, by immunity. Settler violence surges. Settlement spreads. Palestinian land is swallowed inch by inch, and holy sites are desecrated while the world looks on. The global system means to uphold justice has become paralyzed. So we ask, what is expected of the Palestinian? Must they continue offering their children on the altar of global inaction? Does the international community still believe in a two-state solution? President, Palestinians, like all human beings, like all people, have the right to life, to dignity, to homeland. They are not an exception. We must resolve this conflict as its roots, not just a lasting peace can exist. Not just and lasting peace can exist without the realization of the Palestinian people's right to an independent state. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune stated, and I quote, "We must act decisively to end the ongoing historical injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people. We must urgently revive the peace process, which is currently facing an unprecedented deadlock. It is imperative to compel the occupying power to comply with the relevant United Nations resolutions and to adhere to its obligation. The solution is well known. It's time for its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Special Coordinator Kak and Dr. Sidwa for their important and thought-provoking briefings this morning. Mr. President, this Council has continuously discussed the immediate effect, devastating effect of a number of concerning recent developments in the occupied Palestinian territories. In Gaza, we've discussed the disastrous humanitarian situation, more than 53,000 dead, over 100,000 injured, and the entire population on the brink of a man-made famine. As part of an overwhelming majority of voices in this Council, Denmark reiterates once again that humanitarian aid must flow freely and at scale into Gaza in line with international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles. We have opposed an expanded Israeli military offensive, and we have called for an immediate end to the war, along with the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. In the West Bank, we've called for an end to settler violence and illegal settlements, which have recently accelerated an unprecedented speed. Yet, we continue to witness forced displacement, demolitions, and movement restrictions imposed on Palestinians. Mr. President, as we condemn the immediate effects of these developments, this Council has a responsibility to address their long-term impact on international peace and security. And let me make 3 points in this regard. First, the people of Gaza are starving. Starvation, especially for children, can cause irreversible harm that could impact the rest of their lives. The IPC warns that 71,000 children under 5 years old and 17,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women are threatened by acute malnutrition. We stress the need for Israel to take immediate action to protect the human rights to life. All parties to the conflicts are bound to comply with international humanitarian law and the obligation to protect civilians, including Palestinian children, from harm. We also recall that the right to food is a fundamental human right. Second, the war in Gaza has caused major destruction of civilian infrastructure with devastating effects on children's education. More than 95% of all schools in Gaza have sustained damage. 660,000 children are pushed out of school and have lost as much as 19 months of education. In occupied East Jerusalem, another 800 students were forced out of their classrooms earlier this month after Israeli forces forced the closure of 6 UNRWA schools. Losing access to education risks leading to long-term consequences for children's well-being and learning. Education is critical for coping with trauma of war, and we just heard this morning Dr. Sidwa assessing that half of Gaza's children are suicidal. And education is critical for building relevant skills needed to rebuild the country once the conflict is over. We reiterate that civilian infrastructure, including schools, must be protected, included by refraining from the use for military purposes. We call for Palestinian children's rights to safe education to be protected. Third, in the West Bank, Israel is taking control of record amount of Palestinian land, displacing Palestinians into isolated enclaves, making it virtually impossible to form a contiguous and viable future Palestinian state. We recall that the EU has adopted sanctions against violent extremist settlers and encourage other council members to do the same. Recently, we've also taken note of the Israeli government's disturbing decision to initiate land registration in Area C and register it to private Israelis. Denmark reiterates that any attempt by Israel to annex Palestinian land would be unacceptable and violate international law. Mr. President, in Israel, Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks have caused extreme and lasting trauma and has pushed Israelis and Palestinians further apart. We continue to condemn the brutal terrorist attack and the ruthless hostage-taking by Hamas, and we reiterate our demand that all hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Taken together, these developments do nothing to serve the long-term interests of peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis. Denmark remains firmly committed to Israel's security. However, this cannot come at the cost of the civilian Palestinian people and their right to live in peace and dignity. I therefore reiterate Denmark's urgent calls to Israel to halt the ongoing and intensified military offensive and immediately allow for the full resumption of humanitarian aid. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations must be allowed to work independently and impartially to save innocent lives now. We can neither ignore the devastating immediate effects of the current developments, nor their long-term impact on future generations of Palestinians and the viability of the two-state solution. Denmark maintains that the two-state solution is the only viable path to achieve permanent peace and stability in the Middle East. We look forward to the upcoming conference on the implementation of a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the Parliament representative of Denmark for her statement, and now I give the floor to the Parliament representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to thank Special Coordinator Kak for her briefing today and for asks. I also want to thank Dr. Sidwa for his testimony and for his work in Gaza. Mr. President, many times we have said we are lost for words, but we cannot repeat these phrases over and over again. Early on during our council term, I instructed my team to avoid lengthy explanations of the situation on the ground in our statements. This is for the briefers, who usually on a weekly basis or even more often inform us about the state of affairs. And here at the UN and in the Security Council, I think we are very lucky. We are very privileged. We are honored to have the best briefers on the situation on the ground, from Special Coordinator Kak to Undersecretary General Fletcher to civil society briefers like Dr. Sidwa today. Our role is not to challenge the briefers. is not to challenge the messages, but to address the message. Our role is to take positions, to be the one who takes into account briefings, the one who can carefully examine the positions of the others and find possibilities for the Council to react to threats of international peace and security. Mr. President, my statement can be summarized in one word and one sentence. The word is responsibility. And the statement is, we have responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza. Burning tents, striking school tent shelters, continuously displaying civilians, causing hunger, shutting down hospitals, cutting essential services. These grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law have pushed thousands of civilians to the brink of survival. As the task of listing every single cruelty has become impossible, our responsibility not to remain silent has become clearer, and the responsibility to act. We have a clear responsibility to protect civilians. With the alarm bells ringing through the latest IPC report and the information circulating on the hunger in Gaza, we continue calling for immediate lifting of the blockade on Gaza. As the full blockade surpasses 2 months, we must be clear that the current volume of aid reaching Gaza is not enough, and that entry at scale and safe and unhidden distribution are urgently needed. Crossings need to be open. All possible corridors used and facilitation must be granted. Safe passage for medical personnel and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. Time is of the essence. We repeat that any actor delivering humanitarian assistance must adhere to international humanitarian law and international principles on humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We repeat our deep concerns over the new model of distribution of aid. We welcome the UN coordinated plan to resume humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza, and as clearly underlined in today's statement by the EU High Representative Kallas, we recall the indispensable role of the UN in distributing humanitarian assistance. During the ceasefire, the UN proved that it can deliver if allowed. Mr. President, we have a clear responsibility to act. This is why Slovenia fully supports the ongoing efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to find a negotiated solution for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on all parties to engage in good faith. This is why Slovenia strongly supports the conference on the two-state solution to be held in June under chairmanship of France and Saudi Arabia. But we do believe these efforts should be done hand in hand with the action of the Security Council. Time is of the essence. The Council should be clear in its unambiguous demand for unimpeded humanitarian access, and that is why we support urgent action of the Council. We hope the Council will show unity when voting on a humanitarian resolution that is now being discussed among the elected members. Mr. President, remaining silent is not an option. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le
Thank you,
Président,
Mr.
la
President.
France remercie
Mr.
la
President, France
coordonnatrice
thanks
spéciale, Madame Sigrid
Special
Cad,
Coordinator, Madame
et
Sigrid Cad,
Monsieur le
as well
docteur
as
Féroz
Dr.
Sidois
Feroz Sidwa
pour leurs
for
exposés qui viennent
their
nous rappeler
briefings,
le
which serve as
calvaire
a reminder
des
of the
populations
ordeal
civiles de
being
Gaza.
endured by civilians
Monsieur le
in
Président, la
Gaza.
France n'oubliera
Mr.
jamais
President, France will
les
never
atroces
forget
attaques terroristes du
the
7 octobre
heinous terrorist
2023,
crimes perpetrated on 7 October
les
2023,
otages
the
encore à Gaza aux mains
hostages
du Hamas et
who
d'autres
remain
groupes
in
terroristes
Gaza in the
doivent être
hands
libérés.
of Hamas and other
Et
terrorist
le
groups must be
ministre l'a
released.
rappelé
And the minister has
ici même,
recalled here
le Hamas
reiterated the fact that
ne fait pas et ne
Hamas
doit pas faire partie
is not
de la
and
solution
cannot
à Gaza.
be a part
Il
of the
doit
solution in
être
Gaza.
désarmé,
Hamas
il
needs to
doit
be
être
disarmed
politiquement
and must be
neutralisé.
politically
Mais la
neutralized.
population civile de
However, the
Gaza
civilians
n'est
in
pas
Gaza
le Hamas.
are not
Et elle
Hamas.
subit une
And
situation
civilians in Gaza are
humanitaire
enduring a humanitarian situation that
désastreuse
is
face à laquelle
devastating.
ce Conseil doit
And
agir
the Security Council
en
has an obligation
continuant
to
à
act
exiger
in
d'Israël
response by
qu'il se
continuing to
conforme à
demand
ses
that
obligations
Israel
en vertu du
meet
droit
its obligations under international
international
humanitarian
Le
law,
Conseil
and
doit
the
agir
Security Council
et
must
adopter une
act
résolution
and
humanitaire.
adopt a humanitarian resolution.
Premièrement, toutes
Firstly,
les
all
entraves
obstacles
à l'entrée et à
to the
l'acheminement d'aide
entry and
humanitaire et
delivery of
toutes les
humanitarian
restrictions
assistance
sur
and
les
all
quantités et la
restrictions
composition
on the
de celles-ci doivent
quantity
être
and
levées.
composition of this
Les
assistance need to
quantités
be lifted.
extrêmement restreintes entrées
The
ces derniers jours
highly
ne
limited
permettent pas
quantities
de
of
répondre aux
recent
besoins des
days
populations,
are
a
insufficient when it
fortiori
comes to meeting the
après
needs of the
11 longues semaines de
populations,
blocus total.
especially after 12
Les images
long
de personnes
weeks of total
affamées prenant
blockade.
d'assaut
The
des camions
images
et des
of
points de distribution de l'aide
desperate,
en sont
starving
une
people throwing
illustration
themselves
tragique.
on trucks and
Des
aid
dizaines de
distribution
tonnes
points
d'aides
are a
financées
tragic
par la
illustration of
France
this.
et d'autres
Dozens of
pays
tons of
ne peuvent être
assistance
acheminées à
financed
Gaza.
by France
C'est
and other
inacceptable.
countries not being delivered to
Deuxièmement,
Gaza
nous
is
apportons, nous
unacceptable.
réitérons
Second,
notre plein
we
soutien aux
reiterate
Nations
our
Unies
full support for
et
the
à leurs
United
partenaires
Nations
humanitaires
and humanitarian
qui ont
partners
prouvé leur
thereof,
capacité
who
à
have
acheminer
demonstrated their
l'aide dans le
ability
plein
to deliver
respect
assistance
des principes
fully
humanitaires.
in line with
Nous saluons le
humanitarian
plan annoncé
principles.
le 16
We
mai
applaud
qui
the plan
renforce
that
les
was
garde-fous
announced on
contre les
16
risques de
May,
détournement
which
de
shores
l'aide.
up
Nous
safeguards
appelons à ce
against
titre
the
Israël
risks of
à
a
permettre le
diversion.
plein
And we
accès
call in
des
this regard
personnels
upon
des
Israel
Nations
to
Unies à Gaza
facilitate and to
afin
allow
de
for full
vérifier la
access of
délivrance
UN
de l'aide
personnel to
humanitaire
Gaza in
comme
order
le
to
prévoit
verify
la
the delivery
résolution
of humanitarian assistance
2770.
as stipulated
Je le répète,
in resolution
nous apportons notre
in
soutien à
resolution
l'UNRWA,
2720.
au
We
secrétaire
recall our
général
support for UNRWA,
adjoint Fletcher
the
et à ses
Undersecretary General
services,
Fletcher
à
and to his
l'ensemble
services,
des
and we support
agences,
all
fonds,
UN
programmes,
agencies, funds, and
organisations
programs,
du système
as
des
well as
Nations Unies engagés
systems
sur le
who are
terrain pour
working
témoigner
on the ground,
honnêtement,
seeking to provide
impartialement
honest,
et agir en
impartial
humanité.
testimony and to
Nous
deliver
demandons à
on
Israël de
humanitarian
permettre aux
needs. We
Nations
call upon
Unies
Israel
et à
to
leurs partenaires
allow the United
humanitaires
Nations
d'opérer
and
en toute
humanitarian partners
sécurité
to operate in
la
full
mise en
safety and
place d'un système
security, the
alternatif
establishment of an
qui ne
alternative
respecte
system
ni le droit
which respects
international,
neither
ni ses
international
principes
law nor
humanitaires et
humanitarian principles
engendrerait des
thereof, and
déplacements
which
forcés de
made
population
gender
n'est tout
and
simplement
genders
pas
forced
acceptable.
displacement of people is
La
simply
journée d'hier a montré
unacceptable.
de façon criante
Yesterday was
les
a
limites du
stark
dispositif mis en
illustration
place par
of the
Israël.
limitations of the mechanism that
La
Israel
France
has
rappelle en
established.
outre sa ferme
Moreover, France
opposition à tout
recalls
projet
its
d'occupation
firm
permanente
opposition to any
par
permanent
Israël de la
occupation
bande de
plan by
Gaza
Israel
et de
for the Gaza
déplacement
Strip
forcé de
and
la
the
population.
forced displacement
Ces
of
violations graves du droit
people.
international
These
mèneraient à
grave
une impasse
violations of
absolue.
international law
En
are
outre,
leading to
la
a
protection
complete
des populations
impasse.
et
Moreover,
infrastructures
the protection
civiles
of civilians
fait
and civilian
pleinement partie des
infrastructure
obligations
is
d'Israël
part and
au titre des
parcel
conventions
of
de Genève.
Israel's
Les frappes
obligations
répétées
under
sur
the
des
Geneva
écoles,
Conventions.
des hôpitaux, des
Recurrent
habitations
strikes
civiles
targeting schools,
sont
hospitals,
inacceptables et doivent cesser.
homes are unacceptable and
Monsieur le
must
Président, il est
end.
urgent qu'Israël
Mr.
cesse ses
President, there
opérations
is an
militaires et
urgent
qu'un
need for
cessez-le-feu
Israel
permanent
cease its
soit
military
établi
operations for
à Gaza.
a permanent
La
ceasefire to be
France
established
appelle
in
les
Gaza.
parties à
We
revenir au
call
plein respect de
upon
l'accord de
the parties
cessez-le-feu
to revert
et
back to
salue les
full
efforts
respect
des
with the
États-Unis,
ceasefire. We
du
applaud the
Qatar et
efforts
de
undertaken
l'Égypte
by
pour
the United
faciliter
States,
les
Qatar,
pourparlers.
and Egypt as they endeavor to
Je
facilitate
le réitère,
negotiations. I wish to
nous sommes
reiterate the
solidaires
following.
sans
We
faille
stand in
avec les familles de
solidarity,
tous les otages qui
solidarity
doivent
with all
être
the
libérés
families of
sans
all of
délai.
the hostages who need to be
Nous réaffirmons le
released
droit
without delay. We
des Israéliens
reaffirm
à vivre
the
en
right of
sécurité
Israelis
et
to live in
condamnons
safety and
les
security. We
récentes attaques
condemn the
houthies.
recent Houthi attacks.
Mais l'urgence, c'est de
However,
construire une
there's an urgent
alternative à la
need
guerre
to
pour les
propose an
Palestiniens et
alternative
les
to war
Israéliens.
for Palestinians and
Une
Israelis,
alternative fondée
an
sur la solution à
alternative
deux États
rooted
et
in
la
the two-state
satisfaction des
solution,
aspirations légitimes des
one
deux
that
peuples,
reflects the
palestiniens et
legitimate
israéliens
aspirations
tout
of the
autant,
two
à
peoples,
avoir un
and
État
Palestinians
et à
and
vivre
Israelis, to
en paix
have a
et en
state
sécurité.
and to live
La
in
France
peace
remercie
and
les États
security.
membres de leur
France thanks
mobilisation
member
lors de
states
la
for their
réunion
mobilization
préparatoire du
during the
23
preparatory
mai,
meeting on the
en
23rd of May,
particulier ceux qui ont accepté
specifically
la
those who
responsabilité
have
de groupe de
accepted
travail.
responsibility
Il faut
of the
maintenant
working
prendre des
group.
engagements
There's a
concrets,
need now to adopt
politiques, financiers et
concrete political,
matériels
financial,
pour
material
préserver la
commitments
solution à deux
to
États dans la
preserve the
perspective
two-state
de
solution
la,
with a
de
view
la
to
conférence
the
qu'avec
convening of the
l'Arabie Saoudite,
conference,
la
which
France
France will
co-présidera
co-chair with
le
Saudi
17 au
Arabia on the
20
17th
juin
to the 20th of June,
conférence internationale
2025.
convoquée
This is an
à la demande
international
de
conference which will be
de l'Assemblée
convened at the
générale
request of the
en
General
soutien à la
Assembly
solution des États
to
ici à
support
New
the two-state solution
Le ministre
here
des Affaires
in New
étrangères
York.
l'a
The foreign
rappelé,
minister
la France souhaite
recalled
que cette
that
conférence
France
permette d'avancer conjointement
wishes to see
sur
this
la paix,
conference
la
resulting in
sécurité
meaningful
d'Israël et
progress
de
on
la
peace,
Palestine,
security for
la
Israel and
reconnaissance de la
Palestine, the
Palestine comme État,
recognition of
la
Palestine as a
normalisation et
state,
l'intégration régionale,
normalization
le
and regional
désarmement du
integration,
Hamas et la
disarmament of
rénovation de la
Hamas,
gouvernance
and
palestinienne.
the restoration of Palestinian governance. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of France for his statement. And now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening today's meeting. I also thank Special Coordinator CAG for her comprehensive briefing, and I have also listened carefully to the moving testimony of Dr. Sidwa. Mr. President, about 2 weeks ago, we received a sobering briefing from USG Tom Fletcher as he appealed to us to seriously examine the legacy of this council, or the legacy this council would leave in relation to what is currently taking place in Gaza. Today, we have again heard a similar appeal from Special Coordinator CAG and Dr. Sidwa, even as the situation continues to worsen in unimaginable ways. No one should be made to live under the horrific circumstances that Palestinians in Gaza have been experiencing since 7th of October. This council must take principled and urgent action in response to the grave situation that has been foisted on the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, as efforts continue for achieving a return to the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, Guyana is of the view that any peace deal reached should have at least 3 guarantees. First, Palestinians should not be forced to give up any of their rights in exchange for peace. Specifically, they should not be forced to forfeit their homeland. A choice between continuation of the Israeli offensive and forced displacement is a false choice. Second, any peace deal should comply scrupulously with international law. The war in Gaza has set, or seen attempts to set, precedents that are plain violations of international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Recall, for example, restrictions imposed on the United Nations and humanitarian workers. The Knesset legislation against UNRWA is a case in point. Recall also Israel's ongoing aid blockade and its proposed mechanism for aid delivery under the control of its military. Third, the protection and well-being of civilians should remain the chief consideration of any peace deal. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza continues to worsen in unimaginable ways, as described by Special Coordinator. We are especially concerned by the escalating strikes on tents, residential buildings, schools, and crowded hospitals, and the methodical destruction of entire neighborhoods. The constant evacuation orders and the militarization of the majority of the Gaza Strip are equally concerning. There is nothing that can justify this level of violence against civilians, among whom are children, including babies. The aid blockade, which was imposed on 2nd March, seriously crippled the humanitarian efforts that were facilitated by the ceasefire deal. While noting the recent lifting of some restrictions by Israeli officials, we simultaneously noted that certain measures are severely limiting humanitarians' ability to take advantage of this small respite. We noted, for example, the challenges created by insecurity, delays in coordination approvals, and inappropriate routes being provided by Israeli forces that are not viable for the movement of cargo. These are all man-made obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its international legal obligations regarding access to essential goods and services by the civilian population of Gaza. The provision of aid must be governed by the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Guyana expresses its confidence once again in the ability of the United Nations and its partners to deliver aid at the required scale throughout Gaza, if given the relevant facility, by the occupying power. The UN has consistently demonstrated its readiness every time there has been an opportunity to get aid into Gaza. The state of food insecurity in Gaza is also extremely worrying, with many Palestinians experiencing what they describe as a slow death sentence. The testimony of humanitarians in Gaza that, and I quote, Palestinians prefer to die by an airstrike than to go through the suffering of a lack of food and lie to their children about their next meal, end of quote, is an indictment on those who have created these types of choices for innocent civilians. Mr. President, colleagues, it has not escaped us that while negotiations, which we welcome, are ongoing to reach a nuclear deal with the objective of avoiding the potential destruction of another country, different weapons are being employed against the Palestinian people, resulting in their destruction. Regrettably, we are not responding meaningfully to counter the actions of the Israeli Defense Force. What makes this even more concerning is the fact that the visuals of the decimation of Palestinians are live streamed across the globe, yet we are not acting to stop it. The judgment of future generations will be justifiably harsh towards us. We who saw the attempts at obliterating an entire people, but did not act. This council has the opportunity to act now. Enough is enough. Mr. President, in light of the foregoing, Guyana is compelled to reiterate the following appeals. First, we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, in accordance with Resolution 2735. Nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, and it is clear that the military objectives set by Israel cannot be met without severe consequences for civilians. Second, Guyana reiterates its call for the release of all hostages being held in Gaza, as well as all Palestinians detained by Israel without charge. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and all perpetrators must be held accountable. Third, Guyana appeals to Israel to completely lift the humanitarian aid blockade on Gaza and to allow the United Nations and its partners to carry out their life-saving work. International humanitarian law demands that Israel fulfill its obligations towards civilians, and the International Court of Justice has reaffirmed this. Finally, Guyana appeals to this Council and the international community as a whole to work urgently to revitalize the two-state solution as the only just and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the presidency for convening this timely meeting in light of the deepening humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories. We thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her briefings and for her efforts as the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. We also thank Dr. Ferouz Sedwa for his briefings. We remain gravely alarmed by the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the continued military escalation has pushed the population to the edge of survival. There is quite simply no safe place to go in Gaza for civilians. The recent reports of famine risk, forced displacement, and destruction of vital infrastructures are deeply distressing. This is a crisis entirely man-made and preventable, which is exacerbated by the persistent denial of access to a life-saving aid. Somalia strongly condemns the ongoing restrictions on humanitarian access and calls for an immediate, safe, unhindered delivery for the assistance throughout Gaza. All border crossings, including Rafah and Karim Shalom, must be reopened, and international humanitarian law must be respected without exceptions. We also express our concern regarding the mounting pressure on UNRWA and reiterate our full support for its critical role in serving the Palestinian refugees. Attempts to legitimize or defund the agency threatens not only the rights of the refugees, but also the broader stability of the region. We are further troubled by the continuous settlement activity and settlement violence against civilians in West Bank, and the erosion of the legal and historical status quo of the Jerusalem. The right of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination, return to their homeland and statehood, are not subject to negotiation or delay. Mr. President, the blatant disregard for binding decisions of International Court of Justice, including the provisional measures issued in January and March of this year, is a direct challenge to the international legal order. Israel, as occupying power, bears legal responsibility under the international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. These obligations are not optional, they are binding, and they must be enforced. Attacks on civilians and obstruction of humanitarian aid, targeting a medical facility, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war all demand independent investigation and credible justice redress. The consequences of this prolonged conflict are not limited to Gaza. The crisis has triggered widespread regional instability, increasing tensions across the Middle East. The situation risks spiraling into a broader confrontation with a serious implication for the international peace and security. Mr. President, this Council cannot remain silent as innocent lives are lost and humanitarian norms are violated. We call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, the full restoration of humanitarian access across Gaza. Somalia supports all credible diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalation and the conflict resolution, including the upcoming International Peace Conference, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France. We urge the international community to seize this moment and relaunch a serious political process toward a just, lasting peace, one that guarantees the establishment of independent and sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif at its capital, in line with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. To conclude, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its commitment to working alongside fellow Council members and regional partners to uphold international law, defend humanitarian principles, and advance the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Coordinator Karg and Dr. Sidwa for their briefings today, which painted a catastrophic picture. Let me pay tribute to you and to your humanitarian and health worker colleagues working tirelessly to alleviate this suffering. I'll make 3 points. First, the UK has always supported Israel's right to defend itself. It suffered a heinous attack by Hamas on 7 October, and the hostages have been through an unimaginable ordeal. We reiterate our call for their immediate and unconditional release and accountability for those responsible. But as my Prime Minister has said, we strongly oppose the Israeli government's escalating military action in Gaza, which is wholly disproportionate. An immediate ceasefire, not more bloodshed, is the way to secure the release of the hostages and stop the endless cycle of violence. Second, as we have heard again today, the level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Civilians face starvation, displacement, and trauma. The UN warned of the risks from the Israeli government's plan for aid delivery. In Rafah yesterday, we saw this warning become a reality. the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation lost control of its distribution center, with multiple casualties reported and great distress for those desperately seeking aid. In contrast, the UN has a clear plan to deliver life-saving aid at scale. It contains robust mitigations against aid diversion. Brave humanitarians stand ready to do their jobs. 9,000 trucks wait at the border. Our message to Prime Minister Netanyahu is clear. Let aid in and enable the UN to operate now. We reiterate our support for the UN, OCHA, and all its aid agencies. We also reject the Israeli government's unacceptable intention to take control of the Gaza Strip. Permanent forced displacement is a breach of international humanitarian law. Third, President, in the West Bank, violent settlers continue to assault and abuse Palestinians, forcing entire communities to flee. In Jerusalem, provocative visits to holy sites and inflammatory language by Israeli ministers are adding to the tensions. On 20 May, the UK announced further sanctions on individuals and entities promoting violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. We will continue to act against those committing these abuses. President, the UK will not give up on the two-state solution. We will continue to work closely with France, Saudi Arabia, and all our partners towards a successful conference in June, which moves us towards this goal. Finally, let me finish by condemning the horrific murders of Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Milgrim in Washington, D.C. last week, and offering condolences to their families and to their colleagues. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you
señor presidente.
very much, Mr. President.
Panamá agradece la convocatoria de
Panama
esta
would like to
sesión,
thank you for convening
así
this
como a la
meeting,
señora Sigrid
and
Kaag,
we'd like to thank Madam
coordinadora
Sigrid Kaag,
especial
interim
interina para el proceso de
special
paz en
coordinator
Medio
for the peace
Oriente,
process in the
y
Middle
al
East,
doctor
and
Sidwa
Dr. Sidwa
Feroze
Feroze.
por sus intervenciones,
Thank them both for their
y
briefings,
reconoce a los
and we
representantes
recognize the
de
representatives
Israel,
of Israel
Emiratos
and
Árabes
the United
Unidos
Arab
y del Estado
Emirates
Observador de
and the
Palestina,
Observer State of
quienes nos
Palestine,
distinguen con su participación
who
en esta
honor
reunión,
us with their
a la
participation
vez
in
que
this meeting.
agradecemos sus dramáticas explicaciones.
And we thank the briefers
Panamá
for their
escucha con
dramatic
profunda
details they shared
preocupación
with us.
los testimonios
Panama
y las
is very
imágenes que
concerned
cada
about
día
the testimony
evidencian
and
que Gaza
images that
y
bear witness every
Cisjordania
day to the fact that
atraviesan
Gaza and
una
the West Bank
catástrofe
are going
humanitaria
through
de
a
proporciones
humanitarian
devastadoras.
catastrophe of devastating
Reiteramos
proportions.
el llamado
We
urgente
reiterate our
a
urgent call
restablecer un alto al fuego inmediato
for a
que
restoration
permita
of an
facilitar
immediate
el acceso
ceasefire that
seguro
will
de la
facilitate
vital
safe
ayuda
access for
humanitaria
vital
y la
humanitarian
liberación
assistance and
inmediata,
the
digna
immediate,
e incondicional
dignified and
de todos
unconditional
los
release of all the hostages.
Presidente, el
President,
7 de octubre de
the 7th of
2023
October
marcó un
2023
punto de quiebre.
was a turning point.
Ese día,
On
que
that
debía
day,
ser como cualquier
which
otro,
should have been like
se
any other
convirtió en
day,
una pesadilla para cientos de familias
this
israelíes
became a
con
nightmare
consecuencias
for hundreds of
trascendentales.
thousands,
Los
for hundreds
ataques
of Israeli
llevados a
families
cabo
with
en los
far-reaching
kibbutz israelíes,
consequences.
en
The
sus
attacks on the
ciudades,
Israeli
en el
kibbutzes, the
Festival
cities,
Musical de
the
Nova,
Nova Music
en los
Festival,
cuales
where
1,200 civiles
1,200
inocentes
innocent
israelíes,
Israeli
muchos de
civilians
ellos jóvenes,
were present, very many
fueron
of them young
vilmente
people.
asesinados
They
con
were despicably
premeditación y
murdered
crueldad
with
intencional
premeditation and
injustificable en
unjustifiable
territorio
intentional
israelí.
cruelty on Israeli territory.
Fueron asesinadas esas personas y otras
These people
251
were
secuestrados
murdered
y
and
llevadas
another
a túneles oscuros en
251
Gaza,
kidnapped and taken to dark
siendo
tunnels in
este el
Gaza.
saldo neto de la
This was
masacre.
the outcome of the
Fueron
massacre.
arrancados de sus
People who were
hogares y
plucked
del
from their
entorno que les
homes
daba
and
seguridad.
the environment that
El
gave
terror
them
irrumpió
security.
sin distinción,
The terror
dejando
burst
una
into their
herida
lives
que aún
without
permanece
distinction,
abierta.
leaving behind a still open
Queremos
wound.
también destacar el drama
We'd also
silencioso de la
like to
desaparición.
highlight the
silent
Aún hay
drama
rehenes
of those
israelíes
that have
cuya suerte es incierta
those that have
y
disappeared.
numerosos
There are
palestinos,
still Israeli
incluidos
hostages
niños,
whose fate is
que
uncertain,
permanecen bajo los
as well as very
escombros
many
o
Palestinians
detenidos
still
sin
under the
información
rubble,
clara,
where there's no
cuyo
clear
paradero sigue
information
sin
about their
esclarecerse.
whereabouts.
Para unos y otros, la incertidumbre
For
por la
some people, the
desaparición
uncertainty with
impide
regard
cerrar
to
el duelo y
disappearance
perpetúa
prevents
la
them from
angustia.
receiving
Reiteramos
closure in the
nuestro
grieving
acompañamiento y
process.
solidaridad
We
con todas las
reiterate
familias.
our support and solidarity
El
with
horror
all the
desatado por
families.
Hamas el 7 de
The
octubre
horror
no fue un
unleashed on
episodio
the 7th
aislado,
of October was
sino el
not
inicio de una
an
espiral de
isolated
violencia que aún
event.
no se
It was the
detiene
beginning of
y
a
cuyo
spiral of
sufrimiento
violence
mayor
that still hasn't
lo han
stopped,
llevado los civiles.
and it is civilians who have
Desde
suffered the
entonces,
most.
la
Since
población
then, the
palestina
Palestinian population
también ha
has
vivido bajo
also
una amenaza
been living under a
constante,
constant threat,
atrapada entre el fuego
trapped
cruzado
in the
y las
crossfire
consecuencias
and
de
the
decisiones
consequences
políticas
of
y
political and
militares
military
que
decisions
ignoran la
which
dignidad humana.
ignore human dignity.
Desde el cielo, sobre Gaza ya no baja la
The skies
esperanza,
over Gaza no
sino
longer
el
bring hope,
estruendo
but instead
incendiario de una
the
bomba.
roar of bombs.
Ese mismo cielo
This same
que nuestros
sky,
hijos,
which our
sobrinos
sons
y
and
nietos
daughters, nieces and
observan
nephews
con
look
asombro y
upon with
alegría
amazement and
cuando
joy
vuelan una cometa
when they see
o ven pasar un
a
ave,
kite flying or they
se ha
see a bird
convertido
flying
para millones
overhead.
de
For
personas
millions of
en
people,
una señal de alarma,
this sky has become
una advertencia de
an
que la
alarm,
muerte
a
acecha
warning that
y puede
death
llegar
lies in
en
wait
cualquier
and it
momento.
can arrive at any
Y en
time.
tierra, donde antes había escuelas
And
llenas de
on land
voces
where
infantiles que
previously there
merecen
were
futuro y
schools
hogares
where
dignos,
children had
con olor
dignified
a pan
homes, where there
recién
was
hecho,
a freshly baked
hoy
bread.
solo quedan escombros, hambre
Now
y
there's
la
only
sombra
hunger,
imponente de un
rubble,
tanque de guerra.
and the imposing
Los que debían
shadow
ser
of a
sus
war
años más
tank.
felices
What should have
se han
been their
convertido en un
happiest
campo
years
de
has now
ruinas,
become a wasteland
marcado por
of
sirenas,
sirens,
explosiones y
explosions,
una amenaza
and
constante,
constant threat,
generando temores que
generating
ninguna
fears
persona
that no
debería
person,
experimentar.
irrespective of their age, should
Más de
experience. More than
53,000 palestinos han
53,000
muerto
Palestinians
y
have died,
decenas de miles han
and hundreds
resultado
of
heridos
thousands
durante el
have been
conflicto.
wounded during the conflict.
Más de 1.9 millones de
More than
personas
1.9
han
million
sido
people have been
desplazadas en
displaced
Gaza,
in Gaza,
algunas de ellas
some of them
más de 10
more than
veces.
10 times.
El 81% del
81%
territorio
of the
ha
territory
sido
has
declarado
been
zona
declared
militarizada
a
o
militarized
sujeta
zone
a órdenes de
or subject
desplazamiento.
to displacement
En
orders.
Cisjordania, las
In the West
restricciones de
Bank, the
movimiento, las
restrictions
demoliciones y
on
la
movement,
violencia
demolitions,
han
and
agravado aún
violence
más una
have
situación
worsened
ya insostenible.
a situation that was already
Señor
unsustainable.
presidente,
President,
la situación de los niños en
the
Gaza
situation for
es
children in
especialmente
Gaza is
alarmante.
particularly alarming.
UNICEF ha advertido
UNICEF
que
has
más de
warned us
70,000
that more than
menores de 5
70,000
años
children under 5
podrían
years of
sufrir
age
desnutrición
could
aguda,
suffer from
incluidos
acute
14,000
malnutrition,
con
including
desnutrición severa.
14,000 with severe
Muchos de
malnutrition.
estos niños ya
Very
están
many of
muriendo
these
por
children
causas
are
completamente
dying
prevenibles.
due to completely
Nos
preventable
preocupa el
causes.
colapso casi
We're
total
concerned at the virtual
de
total
los
collapse of
servicios
essential
esenciales.
services.
Según la Organización
According
Mundial de
to
la
the
Salud,
World Health
solo
Organization,
19 de los
only
36
19 of
hospitales en
36
la franja
hospitals in the strip
siguen
are
operativos
still operational.
y al menos
And at
aproximadamente
least
el
approximately
94% de ellos
94%
están
of those
inoperantes,
are
dañados
out of
o
commission,
destruidos
damaged or
parcial o
destroyed, either
totalmente.
partially or totally.
El hospital Kamal Adwan,
Kamal
centro que
Adwan
trataba
Hospital, a
desnutrición
center
severa
that
en el norte
dealt
de
with
Gaza,
severe malnutrition in the
suspendió
north of
operaciones
Gaza,
el 20 de
suspended
mayo.
its operations on the
En
20th of
todo el
May.
territorio solo quedan 2,000 camas
Throughout the
hospitalarias
territory, there
para
are
más
only
de 2
2,000
millones
hospital
de
beds
personas.
left for more than 2
De
million
acuerdo con las
people.
Naciones Unidas,
According to the
las
United
cocinas
Nations, the
comunitarias apenas
community
logran distribuir
kitchens are
300,000
only able to
raciones
distribute
diarias cuando
300,000
se
rations per
requieren
day
más
when
de
what is
2
required are
millones.
more than 2 million.
El acceso limitado y
Limited and
fragmentado a
fragmented
insumos
access
básicos,
to basic necessities,
alimentos,
food,
medicinas,
medicines,
agua
drinking
potable,
water,
no puede seguir siendo la norma.
cannot continue to be the norm.
Tomamos nota con profunda
We are
preocupación
very concerned
de
to
los
take
incidentes
note of the
ocurridos
incidents
ayer
that occurred
cuando el caos
yesterday
provocado por una
when
población
the
palestina
chaos caused by
desesperadamente hambrienta
a
sobrepasó
despairing
las capacidades
Palestinian
del centro de
population
distribución
who
que
were
había sido establecido.
hungry
Estos hechos
overcame a distribution
dejan en
center.
evidencia
These facts
las limitaciones de
demonstrate
dicha
the
solución
limitations of
y
this
subrayan la
solution
urgente
and
necesidad
underscore the
de
urgent
una
need
mejor coordinación
for there to be better
con la
coordination
participación de las
with the
agencias de Naciones
participation of
Unidas
the United
que
Nations
garantice un acceso
agencies that will
seguro y
guarantee
una distribución
safe
más efectiva
access
y
and more
amplia
effective
de la
and broad
ayuda
distribution
distribution of humanitarian assistance.
todo esfuerzo humanitario
all
debe regirse
humanitarian
por los
efforts
principios de
should be
neutralidad,
led by the principles of
imparcialidad e
neutrality,
independencia,
impartiality, and
para
independence
garantizar que la
in
ayuda
order to
llegue a
guarantee
quienes más
that
la
aid
necesitan,
reaches those that need it
sin
the most,
interferencias
without
ni
interference or
condicionamiento.
any conditions being imposed.
Panamá expresa su
Panama
reconocimiento y
expresses
homenaje
its
a los trabajadores
tribute
humanitarios de las Naciones
to and
Unidas
thanks to
y al personal
humanitarian
sanitario
workers of the
que en
United
medio del
Nations and
horror
others who,
siguen prestando
in the midst of
auxilio
this
con
horror,
valentía y
continue
dedicación.
to provide
Su labor
assistance with
representa una
bravery.
luz de
Their
esperanza
work
en
is a
medio del
flicker of hope
sufrimiento.
in the midst of suffering.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
Panamá reitera su llamado
Panama reiterates
urgente
its
a
urgent
detener la
call for
espiral
an
de
end to be put
sufrimiento
to the
de
suffering of
israelíes y
the
palestinos.
spiral of suffering of
Es la
Israelis and
oportunidad de salvar
Palestinians.
vidas,
The time has come to
de
save
permitir que la
lives,
ayuda
to
humanitaria
allow
llegue sin
unimpeded
impedimentos y de
access for
lograr la
humanitarian
liberación digna,
assistance and to bring
inmediata
about the
e
dignified,
incondicional
immediate, and
de
unconditional
quienes aún
release
permanecen en
of those who
cautiverio.
still remain in captivity.
No hablamos solo
We
de un
are
cese de
not just speaking about
hostilidades,
a cessation of
sino de un
hostilities, but
despertar
rather a
moral,
moral
de
awakening,
recuperar la noción básica de que
a
toda vida
restoration
humana
of the basic
cuenta.
notion that every human
El futuro
life
de Gaza
matters.
no
The
puede
future of
continuar
Gaza cannot
secuestrado
continue
por
to
el
be held
extremismo de
hostage
Hamas
to the
ni
extremism
por
of
su intención
Hamas
expresa de atemorizar al
by
pueblo
its
israelí
express intention
para
to
mantenerlo
terrorize the
rehén de
Israeli
sus
people
amenazas.
and keep them
El
hostage
futuro
to
de
their
Palestina e
threats. The
Israel
future of
no
Palestine
puede
and
seguir
Israel
siendo
cannot
rehén del
continue
miedo,
to be
del
hostage to
odio y de
fear,
la
hate,
desesperanza.
and despair.
Solo la valentía
Only
política,
political
la
courage,
compasión,
compassion,
la voluntad
and a
auténtica
genuine
de
will for
reconciliación y
reconciliation
los esfuerzos para una reconstrucción
and efforts for a
integral
comprehensive
podrán abrir paso a
reconstruction
una
will
paz
be able to
duradera
open the path
en la que
towards
israelíes y
lasting peace, where
palestinos
Israelis and
puedan vivir
Palestinians
lado a
are
lado
able to live
en
side
paz,
by side
con
in
fronteras
peace
seguras,
with secure,
reconocidas y
recognized, and
mutuamente
mutually
respetadas.
respected borders.
La paz no es la
Peace is
ausencia de
not the
guerra,
absence of
es la
war, it
presencia
is
de
the
dignidad.
presence of dignity.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Panama for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. Siri Kag, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process ad interim, for a detailed and sobering briefing on the situation in the Middle East, particularly with reference to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I also acknowledge the compelling contribution of Dr. Fairouz Sidwa. Mr. President, while Sierra Leone acknowledges the fragile but incremental progress in Syria and Lebanon, the unfolding catastrophe in Gaza and the persistent violence in the West Bank remain matters of grave and urgent concern. The past months have witnessed one of the darkest moments for civilians in Gaza. The persistent obstruction of life-saving humanitarian aid, systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, and widespread loss of innocent life have breached not only the bounds of humanitarian concern, but also raised serious questions of accountability under international law. The prolonged blockade and the military operations by the Israeli Defense Forces have rendered over 80% of the territory either under evacuation orders or de facto inaccessible. These actions have created catastrophic conditions that imperil the survival of the civilian population and heighten the risk of starvation, malnutrition, and lawlessness. The month of May alone have seen hospitals, such as the Indonesia and European facilities in Gaza, struck by attacks, further diminishing access to urgent care. The repeated targeting of healthcare infrastructure and personnel is a clear violation of international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. Civilian objects must never be used for military purposes, nor civilians used as human shields. The protection of civilian lives must remain a cardinal principle for all parties to the conflict. In the West Bank, the upsurge in settler violence, forced displacement, and destruction of property, particularly in Tulkarem, Jenin, and Tobas, is deeply concerning. We deplore all such acts, including the killing of civilians by any actor. Mr. President, the toll on civilians in Gaza, especially women and children, continues to shock the global conscience. Sierra Leone stands firm in its commitment to the UN Charter and to the fundamental principles of peace, justice, and human dignity. Accordingly, we must collectively recognize that the situation unfolding in Gaza now bears many of the hallmarks of mass atrocity crimes. The risk is not theoretical. It is real, credible, and escalating. Given our experience, we understand too well the consequences of delayed international action or inaction. We also recall with painful clarity the global failure to prevent the mass atrocities in Rwanda and Srebrenica, subsequently declared as genocide by competent international courts. The International Court of Justice, in its landmark decisions, has underscored the legal and moral duty to act to prevent genocide. The obligation to prevent genocide is not discretionary. It is a preemptory norm of international law, binding on all states. It imposes duty not only to refrain from committing such crimes, but to take active, timely measures to avert them. Presently, we face a moment no less consequential. We are deeply alarmed by the consistent report of indiscriminate bombardment, destruction of vital infrastructure, deprivation of humanitarian assistance, and inflammatory rhetoric. These patterns may contribute to creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group in whole or in part, which is explicitly prohibited under the Genocide Convention, which codifies customary international law. We therefore call for the immediate and unimpeded humanitarian access and for urgent international action to forestall further deterioration of the situation. The closure of crossings and the obstruction of aid are unacceptable and must be reversed without delay. The complicity of the international community must not be repeated. Further, the provision of humanitarian aid must be fully aligned with the established humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These principles are not only foundational to the effectiveness of aid delivery, but essential to ensuring that assistance reaches those in greatest need. Aid must never be instrumentalized as a tool of war or subjected to conditionalities that compromise the dignity or survival of affected populations. The integrity of humanitarian operations must be protected at all times, and all parties must allow for safe, timely, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors in accordance with IHL. Mr. President, in January 2024, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures in the case South Africa versus Israel, directing the State of Israel to take all necessary steps to prevent acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention. On 24 May 2024, these measures were expanded to include halting the military offensive in Rafah and allowing humanitarian access. Sierra Leone underscores that these orders are binding. Compliance is not a matter of political discretion, but a legal imperative. Failure to do so threatens the legitimacy of the International Court of Justice and undermines the credibility of the rules-based international system. Colleagues, at the core of the current catastrophe lies a crisis of accountability. The scale of suffering endured by civilians in Gaza and in the state of Israel must not go unaddressed. Perpetrators of grave violation of international law must be held responsible. Sierra Leone believes that upholding international law is indispensable to restoring justice and preventing further atrocities. This Council therefore cannot remain silent. The Council must act with the clarity and conviction that this moment demands. The credibility of the Council and the lives of the thousands of civilians depend on it. Sierra Leone urges a renewed commitment to this Council's charter responsibilities, particularly in preventing atrocity crimes and upholding international humanitarian law. In the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda and in the Pact for the Future, calls have been made for a more predictable and principled approach to early warning, prevention, and accountability. These frameworks must be operationalized through consistent Council engagement and action, including through veto restraint initiatives, particularly in contexts where the risk of mass atrocity is acute. Mr. President, as we call for urgent action on mass atrocity risk, Sierra Leone affirms that only a political solution can bring sustainable peace. We reiterate our support for the two-state solution, with an independent state of Palestine living side by side with the state of Israel in peace and security. While humanitarian actions are vital, they are no substitute for a sustainable diplomatic process. Ceasefire, release of hostages, and the lifting of humanitarian blockades must be the starting point. We commend the diplomatic efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, and urge for continued mediation. We call on the parties to act with urgency and in good faith. Sierra Leone believes that unless the root causes of occupation, settlement expansion, and political exclusion are addressed, durable peace will remain elusive. We affirm our full support for a negotiated, just, and lasting political solution, grounded in international law and the relevant UN resolutions. This conflict has inflicted immense suffering, claimed countless lives, and seen too many missed opportunities for peace. The collapse of the ceasefire in March alone resulted in over 3,500 additional civilian deaths, with more than 50 hostages still held in captivity. The international community bears a collective responsibility not only to halt the mayhem, but to foster the conditions for lasting coexistence and peace. We therefore conclude by urging this Security Council to act. We also urge the Council to ensure full respect for international law, accountability for all serious violations, and protection for all civilians, regardless of identity. Let us not allow this moment to pass with inaction or equivocation. The credibility of this Council and the lives of thousands depend on what we choose to do now. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and Interim Sigrid Kaag for the briefing on the situation in Gaza, as well as Dr. Sidwa for his testimony. We wish to take this opportunity to extend our solidarity with the humanitarian coordinator, Tom Fletcher, in connection with the attacks that targeted him after his latest briefing at the Security Council of the United Nations. Mr. President, every new day brings with it tragic news from the Palestine-Israel conflict zone. News headlines are broadcasting the horrific shattering of new records, the number of dead children and women, journalists, humanitarian workers is staggering. Strikes targeting schools and hospitals are no longer shocking to anybody. They have long ago become the living nightmare of the residents of the Gaza Strip, and one can only guess at the conditions being endured in Gaza by those who stand ready to selflessly fulfill their humanitarian duty before the Palestinian people. Despite this, the hope for the possibility of a peaceful resolution to the conflict and the restoration of the January deal, which has been kindled by reports about the intense efforts undertaken by mediators, this hope was still alive. However, this hope was not fated to come to pass. On 16 May, Israel launched the Gideon's Chariots operation, which has further exacerbated the suffering endured by peaceful Palestinian civilians. The biblical name belies the brutal aim of this operation, that is control over all of Gaza, the cleansing of the north of the enclave, of the north of the strip from its residents, and their forcible displacements to the south. Already today, the IDF controls 77% of the territory of the Gaza Strip. With the resumption of hostilities in March, nearly 4,000 Palestinians have been killed, and since October 2023, nearly 54,000 people have been killed, 123,000 have been wounded. The military operation has in no way yet helped to resolve the issue of the hostages. The only hostage who was released recently, the U.S.-Israeli citizen Idan Alexander, was handed over by Hamas representatives as a gesture of goodwill. Another 33 hostages were able to return to their homes and reunite with their loved ones as a result of a deal which was reached in January. And the fates of the other hostages against the backdrop of the active military operations in the Strip remains uncertain. Mr. President, the untold suffering endured by the Palestinian population and the remaining hostages is the result of the humanitarian blockade of Gaza, which Israel imposed on 2 March. Despite the sporadic weakening by the Israeli side of the blockade, as a result of which last week permission was granted for the entry of 400 trucks with assistance, despite that, the blockade has effectively been ongoing. Assistance which is permitted to enter is merely a drop in the bucket against the backdrop of the staggering needs. Let us recall, even before the blockade, in order to meet and address the humanitarian situation in the Strip, there was a need to bring in at the minimum 600 trucks every day. Today, the situation is far more catastrophic. Food supplies are dwindling. Most medicines and medical supplies have been depleted, and there's an acute shortage of fuel in order to provide for operations of basic infrastructure. People are desperate. We have seen what happened at the assistance distribution point, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation point. The humanitarian structures working on the ground unanimously proclaimed their readiness and have been proclaiming their readiness, and most importantly, their ability to provide the Gazan people with all basic goods and services as soon as Israel lifts the blockade and removes any and all obstacles for the delivery and distribution of humanitarian assistance, which the UN Secretariat and the majority of the membership of the Council, including the Russian Federation, categorically condemn. Israel's proposed plan flies in the face of humanitarian principles. This plan disregards the needs of certain categories of citizens, including those residing in remote regions, and on the whole, this jeopardizes the lives of both Palestinians and humanitarian workers. We are equally concerned by the ongoing IDF Iron Wall operation in the West bank of the Jordan River, as well as clashes between Israeli troops, settlers, and local civilians. Military operations are engulfing Urkin, Jenin, Tulkarm, Husan, as well as Nablus's and Hebron's environs. Israelis are simultaneously demolishing Palestinian property and carrying out mass arrests of Palestinian civilians. Just recently, at least 40 Palestinians have been detained. Interreligious hatred is being fomented by Israeli leadership's provocative actions, including visits to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound by approximately 1,500 radical right-wing Israelis who were accompanied by the Minister of National Security of Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Attempts by Western Jerusalem to violate the legal and historical status quo of the holy city's sacred site are are illegal and unacceptable. Mr. President, today we're observing a clash of two realities with growing distance between them. On the one hand, there are loud calls for from the international community for there to be respect for international humanitarian law, a ceasefire, the release of detained persons, and the implementation of the two-state solution. On the other hand, Israel's singular focus on achieving all political objectives through military means alone. They have no scruples about selecting their means and no qualms about loss of civilians until Gaza is completely razed to the ground. In this reality, there is room only for war and Old Testament brutality. What can we do to align the reality on the ground and the aspirations of the God's bodies of the United Nations? For that, the international community needs to undertake meaningful efforts to facilitate the resolution to the root cause of the protracted conflict. The fact that the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to establish their own independent state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as the capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel, has not been upheld. This will become possible only following the immediate return to the peace process on the universally recognized international legal basis, at the heart of which was and remains the cornerstone: two states for two people's principle. As the most urgent step to that end, the UN Security Council should send a clear message to the parties about the unconditional cessation of hostilities and to achieve the lifting by Israel of the humanitarian blockade, and this would create favorable conditions for the release of the remaining hostages and detainees, and this would facilitate the resumption of the peace process for Palestinian-Israeli settlement. The tragedy that is occurring before our very eyes in Gaza is, among other things, the consequence of insufficient resolve on the part of the international community to ensure the enforcement of their own resolutions on the establishment of two states, Israel and Palestine. Despite the exceedingly difficult context, reciprocal recriminations, and emotions running high, we believe that we need to achieve having these two peoples surmount decades of hostility and to achieve peace, stability, and prosperity for the entire Middle East region. Any other scenarios harbor grave risks, not just for the region, but for all of humankind. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also begin by thanking Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing today. And we are also grateful to Dr. Firoz Sidwa for his sobering remarks. Those were harrowing details, unimaginable, so difficult to listen to and grasp. And one would shudder to think how all those on ground, all those women and children and doctors and humanitarian workers would be coping with that situation on a daily basis. Mr. President, my delegation would also at the outset recall and reaffirm its complete support to the briefings, the objective and truthful and responsible statements by senior UN officials, including USG Tom Fletcher, before this council. In our view, any undue criticism of their work must be unacceptable. Mr. President, we meet yet again under the shadow of a deepening yet preventable tragedy in Gaza, one that tests not only our conscience, but the very credibility of this council. This is not a natural disaster. It is a man-made catastrophe. As we heard from both briefers today and many other council members, This is a man-made catastrophe driven by Israel, the occupying powers' unrelenting, illegal blockade of Gaza, and the callous bombardment and deliberate killings carried out with full impunity. The numbers are staggering. More than 54,000 Palestinians have been killed, majority of them children and women. Over 122,000 have been injured. Gaza's people face continuous indiscriminate assault from land, air, and sea. The psychological and societal